Okay, well, welcome back. We're going to start with Chapter 2, Theories of Development. Okay, so we can categorize theories of development into several main types. The first type I wanted to cover would be the biological theories. And in Chapter 1, we discussed the issue of the biological clock. Arnold Gesell was a theorist who really believed in the biological clock, and he argued that maturation will proceed naturally and that parents don't need to worry or try and speed up development, that it will happen on its own clock. And he in fact argued that if parents invested too much time and energy into speeding up babies' acquisitions of skills, that they are wasting their time at the minimum, and at the maximum might actually be interfering with normal development. So you see him in this picture helping this baby to sit up, and he said, you know, they'll sit up when they're ready to sit up. There's nothing you can do to make that happen faster. The ecological theories emphasize the evolutionary principle that all sorts of traits are naturally selected for, and in this case Konrad Lorenz is referring to maturation being naturally selected for, that there's a series of changes that we all undergo between conception and death, and that those changes are the ones that have benefited our species over time. This picture is showing Konrad Lorenz in one of his most famous pictures, where he's walking in front of a string of goslings that he was the first thing that they saw moving when they hatched from their eggs, so they identified him as the thing that they should be following. And now a lot of people have extended that principle and have gotten geese to fly next to their cars and all sorts of things, because geese will imprint on the first thing that they see when they first wake up. Lorenz thought that humans might imprint like that, and his research was in humans was devoted to trying to determine whether the first thing that a human baby sees is imprinted upon. And we now know that it's not. Human babies don't form that kind of instant bond with the first thing that they see like a gosling does. So those are our biological theories. Now we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about the next category, which are the psychodynamic theories. The psychodynamic theories take the perspective that there is a dynamic interplay between things that are going on inside of the person and things that are happening around the person, and that there are certain biological factors that drive maturation, but that there are also external factors that drive maturation. So let's start with Freud's psychosexual theory. Alright, so I think we can all agree we're off to an odd start by calling it a psychosexual theory, but that's Freud. He likes that sort of thing, right? He introduced the idea that there are unconscious motives inside of us that drive us to behave in ways that even we don't understand the influence of these unconscious motives. He offered the idea that there are three aspects of personality, each of them more or less conscious, that drive our personality. He came up with this idea that our personalities are like icebergs, where most of our personality is under the water level, which in this case represents the unconscious mind, and that just a little bit of our personality is above the waterline. So let's explore his three concepts, his three aspects of personality. First, completely under the waterline would be the id. And the id is comprised of psychic energy. Your libido, which is your life instinct, and your thanatos, which is your death instinct. Now these things sound pretty harsh, life and death, right? But a lot of people have characterized Freud's concepts as libido meaning sex drive and thanatos meaning aggression. Those are kind of oversimplifications also. Some of his followers have tried to explain in a little bit more detail what libido and thanatos really mean, or at least their interpretation of what Freud meant by it. Libido would be your life force. So yeah, it includes getting your genes into the future, so that would be sex drive. But it also includes all the things that you might do to maintain your health and protect your life. So, you know, putting on a jacket when it's cold or eating when you're hungry would be things that are driven by libido. Thanatos, being your death instinct, is not necessarily the opposite of libido, but it definitely has different motives. Part of it might be aggression, that's true, but it also could be, it could manifest itself as competition with somebody else. You know, when you play a game and you want to win, at the expense of your friend's feelings, you don't really care if they feel bad because they should know that you're better than they are. That's Thanatos. That's Thanatos saying, go ahead and behave aggressively. You know, make somebody else feel bad. That's okay as long as you feel good. The key thing to remember about both of these types of psychic energy is that their goal is to make sure that you're always experiencing pleasure. So Thanatos doesn't really care if your friend's feelings are hurt as long as yours aren't. Thanatos is also the part of our personality that drives self-destructive behaviors. So, for example, biting your nails until, you know, they're so short that they're bleeding, or, you know, your cuticles, those kinds of things. Thanatos doesn't really care about the consequences. All it cares is that it feels good at the moment. You know, over drinking, or, you know, taking up smoking. You know, consciously you probably know that those are harmful, but Thanatos doesn't care. If it feels good now, Thanatos feels like you should do it. So, the basic principle for the id is that it wants you to be experiencing pleasure all the time. So whatever it takes to make sure that you're feeling good, the id wants you to do that. So even if it's socially inappropriate to eat in this setting, you know, you're sitting in class and nobody else is eating, and you do have a bag of potato chips in your backpack, it would be like, pull them on out. Who cares? I don't care if you crumple the bag. I don't care if you're crunching the potato chips. I don't care what anybody, if you're inconveniencing anyone else. I am hungry and I shouldn't be having to feel like this. So the id is all about you feeling good regardless of whatever else might be going on. The next part of the personality to emerge would be the ego. The ego starts to emerge when we're about 6 months old. The id is present at birth, but the ego starts to develop when we're about 6 months old. And it operates on the reality principle. So the ego tries to figure out ways to meet the demands of the id. Because see how the junction between the ego and the id is actually underwater? That implies that your ego can communicate with your id without you being consciously aware of it. So the ego figures out what the id wants. It's hungry or thirsty or it's cold or whatever its problem is. And then it tries to find a reality-based way of meeting its demands, the id's demands. So the ego might say, well, I'm sitting in class and I don't want to be embarrassing and make all this noise. I know I have potato chips, but you know what? Maybe I'll fantasize about the fact that as soon as there's a break, I'm going to eat those chips. Or maybe the reality-based solution would be, instead of getting out the potato chips, maybe I'll take a sip of my water, or get out a stick of gum, or something that is less embarrassing or socially inappropriate, but sort of still kind of meets the needs of the id. That's the ego's job, is to find a way to balance the demands of the id while also balancing the demands of reality. The last part of your personality to develop, according to Freud, and it starts to develop when you're about 5 years old, is your superego. Again, notice that the part of the superego is below the waterline, and in fact you notice that little junction there underneath the waterline where the superego, the ego, and the id can all have like a conference behind your back, and you have no idea what's going on in that unconscious state. The superego is trying to serve as your conscience so that you do the right thing. So the superego takes a while to develop because you have to internalize the morals and the lessons from your environment to build your conscience, your superego. Freud didn't really like the word conscience as a descriptor, but I feel like in English it's the closest one word to superego. So it's all your internalized morals and values and things like that. So you've got your superego on the one hand saying, I should always do what is right and moral. And on the other hand, you've got the id that's saying, I should always be experiencing pleasure. I should never be hungry or thirsty or cold or feeling, you know, unsatisfied sexually or any of those things. I should never feel like that. So you got these two really opposing parts of your personality. The job of your ego is to find a way to balance those two demands in a reality-based way. So sometimes your ego is going to say, well, we should do the right thing, follow the rules, and do what the superego wants. Sometimes it's going to be in your best interest to do what the id wants. You shouldn't necessarily starve to death or let your blood sugar get too low, right? So sometimes your ego is going to go with what the id wants. The goal of a healthy personality is to have a strong enough ego that it can balance those two competing demands in a way that is, reality-based and healthy for you, and that can work out in the long run. So for Freud, our upbringing needs to have plenty of moral teachings so that we can develop our conscience, but not so much morality that we deny our own id's instincts when those are actually the appropriate instincts to follow. So for Freud, we need to have a balance between our biological tendencies to always experience pleasure and then our social need to do the right thing. All right, now he thought that we developed in stages, so he called them psychosexual stages. So I thought I'd just go through kind of quickly what goes on at the stages and what ages are associated with each one. Wherever I say erogenous zone in the table, what I'm talking about is the target of your psychic energy, which is Freudian code for your libido and your thanatos. So your erogenous zone is whatever part of your body basically is the focus of your libido and your thanatos during this stage. So during the oral stage, between birth and 18 months, the erogenous zone is the mouth. So you notice that babies during this age bracket are biting and chewing and sucking and exploring the world with their mouths. And also the big thing that's going to happen during this stage is ultimately you're going to get weaned. And so for Freud, when all of your psychic energy is attached to your mouth, and then you're taught by your environment that it's no longer appropriate to mouth everything and suck on everything and to eat from a bottle or to suck on your thumb, that's going to be a big psychic trauma for you to have to give up this natural way of interacting with the world. So that's going to propel you to the next stage. Now, personality-wise, the biggest characteristic that I think we can all agree that infants have is that they're very dependent on their caregivers, right? For much of this time, they can't even move independently, let alone take care of themselves or feed themselves or do anything independently. So Freud said that overall sense of dependence is really an important part of that first stage. The next stage, okay, now it's starting to get weird, is called the anal stage. And for Freud, that's somewhere between 18 months and 36 months. He said that the erogenous zone is the bowel and the bladder, which has caused a lot of people to go, well, that sounds really creepy. But what he's talking about is that during this stage, most babies are going through potty training. And their biggest challenge is that they're coping with the demands of the environment for them to display this very basic control over themselves. So they have to learn the sensations, they have to learn how to withhold when they maybe would rather let stuff just come out without having to worry about it, and giving up their diapers, and all these things are, again, a psychological trauma. He thought that potty training was traumatic for children. So your first big psychological trauma was getting weaned, and then your second big psychological trauma was getting potty trained. And of course, throughout this stage, between 18 months and 36 months, you do notice babies going through a lot of efforts to display control over their environment. And so you hear babies at this age saying things like me or mine or I do, things like that. They want to put on their own shoes, things like that. And so Freud said, well, those are examples of babies trying to assert their independence and have control over themselves. The next major stage would be the phallic stage, which phallic is sort of a euphemism for penis. He says between 3 and 6 years of age, the erogenous zone becomes the genitals. Now you hear erogenous and you hear genitals and you're probably thinking erotic, and he did not mean erotic. He meant erogenous, where your libido and your thanatos are attached to your genitals. And he thought for toddlers, young children like this, 3 to 6 years of age, looking down and seeing a penis or not is a big event. And he really characterized it like that. You either see a penis or not. Those who looked down and saw a penis according to Freud, had their pleasure principle met. They were like, yay, I'm one of the powerful ones in society. Life is good. It's good to be me. Whereas those who looked down and didn't see a penis had, he said, immediate shame and guilt. That obviously they used to have a penis, but they did something wrong that caused somebody to punish them by castrating them when they were so young that they can't even remember that it happened. And so now they're just overwhelmed with this sense of shame and guilt. So really this was the beginning of the development of gender identity for Freud, that we look down and determine whether we are males or if, oh no, we've been made into females, the lack of penis. Okay, so during the stage, once you decide whether you have a penis or not, the next big thing that's going to happen is that if you're a little boy, you'll develop the Oedipal conflict. If you're a little girl, you'll develop the Electra conflict. So let's talk about the Oedipal conflict, and I'll come back to Electra. So in the Oedipal conflict, the little boy falls in love with his mother and wants to eliminate his father. And so first he tries to eliminate his father by giving him the cold shoulder and letting him know that he's just not welcome here. And of course, Dad's not picking up the message at all, because he's so stubborn and keeps wanting to be with his wife, according to Freud. And so the little boy starts escalating his plans and starts thinking about, well, if he's not going to voluntarily leave, then I'm going to have to make him leave. And so he starts hatching plans for killing his dad. And every plan he comes up with, he realizes he's not going to win. His dad's bigger, he's stronger, he's got a larger penis, obviously, and so there's nothing else to do. There's no way I'm going to be able to exact my plan. I'm going to have to admit that Dad's here to stay. In fact, the little boy supposedly goes through this feeling that if Dad were to find out that I've been coming up with plans and trying to kill him, he's going to be really mad. And he's going to retaliate against my, efforts at aggression by castrating me. The worst thing that Freud thinks a child could come up with is the idea that they would be castrated. And when Freud uses the word castration, he actually means removal of the penis and the testicles. So for Freud, the worst thing that could possibly happen is that the dad is going to retaliate and castrate the little boy. This is what Freud called castration anxiety. The little boy becomes anxious about the possibility that Dad's going to find out and retaliate. So the little boy decides to repress all the lust that he's been feeling towards his mom and all the aggression that he's been feeling towards his dad. And instead, and by repress, I mean put it into that unconscious part of the mind where it's no longer accessible, and instead decides to identify with his dad. So the little boy is going to try and be as much like his dad as he possibly can be, so that someday when he gets older, he'll be able to attract a wife as good as mom is, right? And so he'll have his vicarious mom when he gets older. All right, so Freud kind of thought that same exact thing would happen with little girls, that the little girls would fall in love with their dads, want to kill their moms, and then he kind of got stuck, because if you remember, the little boys didn't try and kill their dads because of castration anxiety, right? But little girls think they were already castrated, according to Freud. I just talked about that on the last little bit when we talked about genitals, right? So if little girls have looked down and come to the conclusion they've already been castrated, what can they possibly have to fear? What would prevent them from just trying to kill their mothers? So Freud really struggled with that, and he ultimately abandoned the Electra conflict and said, well, I don't know what happens with girls, something like that, but I'm giving up. Some of his followers argued that maybe girls never fully repress their lust for their dads and their animosity towards their moms, because they point to how often moms and daughters have tension in their relationships, and how often daughters will still look to their dads for advice or support when they should be looking to their husbands for those things. So, but Freud was never in love with that solution. So he had trouble with the girl's side, that's for sure. So maybe there might be one or the other. I don't know, obviously, but I got to tell you, when I was a student and I was learning this as an undergraduate, 18 to 22-year-old, I thought, man, this stuff is crazy. Oh my gosh, there is no way that I was ever in love with my father and wanted to kill my mother. This is insane. What is wrong with Freud? Why would he say these things? And maybe there is something wrong with Freud, because he actually developed these theories from his interviews, his case study interviews with his patients, many of whom had really significant psychological problems, such as hysterical blindness and other things that are just like, seriously, there's something wrong. He had several of his patients report that they had been sexually abused by their parents or a family member or someone else who Freud, this is 1880s to 1900 Austria. And, Freud was a well-known person. He knew a lot of well-known people in town, and he knew some of these patients' parents or who they were accusing. And he just could not accept that what his patients were telling him was true, which is, that they were abused by these people who he knew. So he thought and struggled with it, and ultimately came to the conclusion that these were not stories of actual sexual abuse by the adult, but instead wishes from the patient toward the person that they were accusing. So that's how he actually initially came up with his whole idea of the Oedipus and electric complexes. He thought it was actually wish fulfillment from his patients towards the adults. So there probably was something wrong with Freud, for one thing, that he was more willing to accept that the young people would make it up than he was willing to accept that maybe some people were harming children. But I gotta tell you, when I became a parent, my mind opened a little bit to the possibility of some of these things he was talking about, because, for example, my daughter, when she was just over 3 years old, I'd just given her a bath and I'm drying her off and she's all cuddly and snuggly, and she's like, when I grow up, I want to marry daddy. And I was like, right on. She's right on time with this Freudian model. That's so funny. And I go, you do? And she said, narrows her little eyes and she goes, but you won't let me. And I was like, wow. It's a little creepy, tiny toddler. Okay. So that kind of was a little coincidental, I thought. And then my son came along, and when he was about that same age, I became everything to that kid. He had to sit between me and his dad. He always wanted to hold my hand. If we went out to eat, he'd run really fast and get into a seat and then pat the one next to me and go, mommy, mommy. Like, I had to sit by him all the time. It was really funny, because when we went through the phase where my daughter was all fixated on my husband, he was like, okay, normal life. I'm into it to be the chosen one. I like it. When I was the chosen one, my husband was like, I don't think he likes me. His feelings were hurt, which was kind of funny, because it's like, he is a small child. I don't think him liking you or not liking you is really the issue, but it does kind of hurt your feelings when you're not the selected parent at the time. And that's true. I have to agree with that. But so the idea that Freud might be onto something with some of this stuff, and maybe overblew some of the other stuff, made it into more than it probably really was, and maybe to cover up the actions of some people that he knew who had done some bad stuff. So anyway, the next stage is a lot less controversial, the latent stage. This is between about 6 years and puberty. Once the child has identified with their same-sex parent and developed their gender identity as a function of that, Freud said that they then enter the latent stage, which what he meant by that is that there was no body part that the libido and the thanatos were attached to. So there was no erogenous zone. Again, some of his followers offered that there are these social and academic demands that seem to be the target of the latent period, so that all the libido and thanatos are attracted to trying to make same-sex friends and do well in school and things like that. So it's not like it's a period of complete quiescence. It's just that there's no body part that has the the libido and thanatos attached. The last stage, and the stage where all of us are supposed to be after puberty, is the genital stage. And now in the genital stage, he means what you might think he means by genital, that really you've got mature sexual interests, and that the goals are to find a mate, reproduce, settle down, rear your children. So he said that's what's going on in the genital stage. So we've got our 5 stages of development. The thing is, the degree to which your needs are appropriately met at these different stages by your parents. So when you're in the oral stage, if they wean you too early or too late, or if during the anal stage they potty train you too early or too late, during the phallic stage you don't have a dad in the house, or the dad who's in the house is too passive, these things can affect how the psychic energy moves from one body part to the next. And Freud says that we can end up leaving some of our psychic energy behind when our needs at those different stages are not being appropriately met. And so as an adult, we can display some of these characteristics of these earlier stages. So for example, an adult who has a fixation at the oral stage may be overly dependent and unable to make their own decisions and things like that. Or a person who's fixated at the anal stage, they are displaying their issues with control. And so if they're potty trained too early, they could end up overly controlled and they could become anal retentive. Or which means they're like really obsessed with orderliness and neatness, and everything has to be in control. Or they could, if they're potty trained too late, end up what Freud called anal expulsive, where they display, all sorts of messiness and tardiness and lack of, concern for, routine and things like that. So depending on how your needs are met, you can end up displaying certain personality characteristics. Freud thought that if you don't have a same-sex parent in your household for you to identify with, that can contribute to gender identity issues, where a person is identifying with their opposite sex parent because that's the only parent who's there, and then they can end up having behaviors that are appropriate for the other sex in their behavior. And of course, for Freud, that would be completely dysfunctional. So he had his little list of things. He thought that you could not get fixated at the latent stage, but again, some of his followers have said, well, you could get fixated at that stage and be overly concerned about academic achievement, or maybe you become a workaholic instead of putting appropriate attention to reproducing and the things that we expect you to do as an adult. So Freud says that we can leave psychic energy behind at these psychosexual stages, and they can manifest themselves in our personality. All right. The other psychodynamic theory that I wanted to present was Erikson's psychosocial theory. A lot of people really like Erikson's theory, and pretty much everybody agrees. All of my students say, why do we even talk about Freud anymore? I thought everybody knew he was wrong, and they assume that he's been discredited. Freud hasn't been discredited as much as you might think he has been, largely because a lot of his claims are completely untestable. So going back to the stuff we talked about in chapter 1, if we can't actually set up a study that would assess whether the things he claims are actually present, then we can't say whether he's right or wrong, can we? I mean, there's no way to test it. Erikson's theory, people tend not to object as much to, even though he's psychodynamic also, largely because, for one thing, he calls it psychosocial theory rather than psychosexual, so we're already off to a better start. He agrees with Freud that there are stages of development, but instead of having erogenous zones where, your libido and your thanatos are attached, he said that we have social conflicts that we have to confront at different stages as we grow and develop. One of the things that's nice about Erikson's stage is that he believes that we continue to grow and develop after puberty. He has stages that go well after puberty. So I made a little chart to show us the different components. So in the infancy period, he says the big social conflict is between whether we can trust our environment or not. If our environment, which is largely going to be our parents, are trustworthy, that's going to set us up in a better position to deal with the next major social conflict. If, on the other hand, our parents have been unpredictable and unreliable, we're going to have a basic sense of mistrust for our environment. We're going to have a difficulty with the next stage. So the next stage is the conflict between autonomy and shame and doubt. And so during this 12 to 24 month period, we have, toddlers who are trying to tie their own shoes and put on their own clothes and decide what they're going to eat and things like that. And when toddlers, according to Erikson, are encouraged for their signs of autonomy, that gives them confidence and willingness to explore, and they're more ready for the next challenge. If we tell them, you can't do that, you're going to make a mess, that's too big for you, those kinds of things, we can give them a sense of shame and doubt, and that's going to make it more difficult to move next. So the next stage is initiative versus guilt. Again, if we encourage preschoolers in their efforts to show initiative, that's going to be more beneficial for them than if we make them feel guilty about them trying to do things on their own. During elementary school, the conflict is between developing a sense of competence versus an overwhelming sense of inferiority. Adolescence, you guys probably remember going through this stage where you were trying to figure out who you were or are. You might still be going through this because it starts pretty much with puberty, according to Erikson, and continues through our 20s, where we're trying to figure out who we are, not what we are, not like what I want to do for a living, because a lot of us struggle with that for a long time. We might change our mind halfway through our lives and things like that. But instead, it's about what kind of person I am and what kind of person I want to be around and how do I want to spend my time and those kinds of things. So if it's solved on the positive side, you will emerge with an identity intact. If not, you'll be experiencing role confusion. During young adulthood, the big job, he said, was to find an intimate pair bond. And he really was talking about finding a mate, because that's going to set you up for the next stage. So forming intimate relationship, developing the virtue of love was a big important factor, he said, for setting us up for the next stage. If a person can't do that, then they can end up in isolation. And he didn't think that you could substitute with like really good friends or something like that, because he wants you to get set up for what he considered the generativity versus stagnation phase. Generativity is most commonly achieved through reproduction, but generativity can also be achieved through like writing a book or mentoring children or co-workers or other ways too. There's other things that you can do that are evidence of generativity. A lot of people who have achieved generativity through children will still do the other generativity acts because they feel like, well, I need to leave more evidence that I was here. If a person can't figure out ways to leave their mark, they can end up in stagnation. And the final stage is late adulthood, and this is when, that's a picture of Erikson that I put in there. This is when we're sort of reflecting on our lives and being able to look back and say, I did the best I could, or, I feel like in general it was a life well lived. Then we can end up in integrity, where we can leave this life feeling like I had a good life. If, on the other hand, a person is spending their time saying, I wish I could go back and I wish it had been different, or denying things about their life, then they could end up in despair. So the neat thing about Erikson's theory is that it has stages that start in adolescence and end in late adulthood, which is different from Freudian theory. It explains a lot of things that sound very logical to us. Yeah, I can remember going through some of those things, or that makes a lot of sense that infants would be feeling that. The thing is, just like Freudian theory, a lot of this stuff is untestable, and so we don't really know whether these things are what we're going through. We don't know if, when you're 3 to 5 years old, if you're punished for showing initiative, if you will always have a sense of guilt. We don't really know the parameters of this theory because most of it's untestable. All right, well, let's shift gears into a whole different way of explaining human development, and this would be the behavioral learning theories. We'll start first with just purely behavioral learning, which is conditioning theories. There's classical conditioning, which you guys might recall from Intro to Psych. It says, psychology, I once attempted Pavlovian conditioning for sex on a girlfriend. His friend goes, how? And he goes, I would play the same song every time we hooked up, thinking I could use it to turn her on whenever I wanted. And the friend goes, and what happened? And he goes, well, the song came on at the gym once, and I've been banned from aerobics for life. So what he's explaining is how he made an association between sexual arousal and a particular song. That's classical conditioning, making that kind of association between something that's generally neutral and then something else that's more meaningful. And the behavioral learning theories that emphasize classical conditioning say that a lot of our behaviors are reflective of associations that we've made in our past. And so we react to things based on our previous experience with similar things or with this very exact situation. And instead of just being able to deal with stimuli, afresh every time. We've got this history of classically conditioned associations. We also have operant conditioned associations. These are that process of learning where we were reinforced for certain behaviors or punished away from other behaviors. Now, this is my pet peeve in life, is hearing people use the phrase negative reinforcement when they mean punishment. So I thought I'd take just a second and show you a chart that might help you to distinguish the different kinds of reinforcement from the different kinds of punishment. So positive reinforcement is where we're going to add something desirable. So the consequence in positive reinforcement is something desirable. So you do a behavior, like let's say study before an exam, and then I positively reinforce you for that behavior. The consequence of that desirable behavior is that I give you something you want, an A, right? So positive reinforcement is we're going to add something desirable when the learner does the behavior we want. Maybe I'll give you some gummy bears for studying. That's a good idea. Yeah. Negative reinforcement is still a consequence that's going to try and get you to do the behavior again, right? Positive reinforcement, so clearly we're trying to get you to do the behavior again. So if you study before the exam and I give you an A, it makes it more likely that you'll study before an exam in the future, right? So I'm trying to get you to do the behavior again by giving you something that you want. In negative reinforcement, I'm trying to get you to do the behavior again by removing something that you don't want. Okay, so notice how I use the words add and subtract in my descriptions here, because operant conditioning is not referring to positive as good and negative as bad. It's referring to positive as addition and negative as subtraction. So if you remember it like that, that'll really help. So in negative reinforcement, I'm going to subtract something undesirable. So for example, as a reinforcement, I might take away some of your chores to reward you for doing something that I wanted, right? So if you will, eat all of your broccoli, I'll do your chore of loading the dishes after dinner. So I take away something that you don't want to do, load the dishwasher, as a reward for something I want you to do, eat your broccoli. So in both of these cases, I want the behavior to repeat. It's just that in the one case, I'm going to add something that you want, or I'm going to, in the other case, take away something that you don't want. And I mean, if you think about it, in both cases, you want the outcome. Obviously, you want that outcome. Yeah, I don't want to load the dishwasher. Okay, I'll eat some broccoli. So I get reinforced in the future for eating my broccoli because I'm hoping I'll get the same consequence. Okay, with punishment, we also have positive and negative punishments. So in positive punishment, we're going to add something undesirable. Okay, so you don't want this to happen. So I'm going to give you chores to do. Oh, I did that on purpose. I put chores in both places because both of them are outcome. Chores, let's assume you don't want to do them, right? Let's assume that chores are undesirable. If I'm going to use chores in the form of a reinforcement, that means I'm going to have to take away the chores, and then you're going to find that reinforcing. So your standing chore, loading the dishwasher after dinner, will be taken away if you do the desirable behavior, the thing I want, eating your broccoli. So you won't have to do the thing you know you have to do if you'll do what I want you to do. In punishment, by adding the chores, if you don't eat your broccoli, you're going to have to not only load the dishwasher, but you also have to sweep the kitchen. So I'm going to add an undesirable outcome in an effort to get you to not do the undesirable behavior from my perspective. So I want you to eat the broccoli, and if you don't do what I want, I'm going to punish you by adding something you don't want. Negative punishment, we're going to take away something you like. Well, if you're not going to eat your broccoli, then you're not getting any dessert, right? So if you aren't going to do the thing that I want you to do, then I'm not going to do the thing that you want me to do. So I'm going to take away something desirable. So I tried to simplify it as much as I could to make it super clear that negative reinforcement is something that the learner actually wants to have happen. And positive punishment is something that the learner does not want to have happen, that I'm adding in. Actually, in punishment, both types of punishment, it's something that the learner does not want to have happen. And in reinforcement, in both cases, it's something that the learner wants to have happen. Right? See the difference? So, the premise in operant conditioning is that we are all just a reflection of our unique sets of reinforcements and punishments that we've experienced across our lifespan, and that our behavior today reflects those punishments and reinforcements that we've accrued over our lifetime. And so the things that we do today are ones that have been reinforced in the past. The things that we don't do today are things that we've been punished for in the past. So that's the basic premise. And the thing about these behavioral learning theories is that it assumes that the environment has control over us. We are a reflection of what the environment has taught us. So that's the idea with conditioning theories. Now with social learning theory, still under behavioral learning, social learning says, you know what, we want to be like other members of our group. So here we have, modeling, where the learner is seeing somebody who they admire and want to be like, and they're displaying the same behaviors. So when you arrive in a new place and you're not exactly sure where to sit or how to talk or what am I supposed to be doing here, you look around and you see what everybody else is doing. That's modeling. And you decide, okay, well, I'll just do what they're all doing because I don't know what else I'm supposed to be doing here. That's modeling. And we, according to this theory, a lot of our behavior is a reflection of stuff that we have seen other people do and we're emulating. This would be the theory that would explain, violence being a result of playing video games and it's taught us to be callous, or from watching TV and it's taught us that violence works, or other things. We're just basically modeling the stuff that we've been exposed to. So social learning theory takes into account a little bit of our own cognition, right? Where we're saying, I want to be like that person. Whereas the conditioning theories are saying we're just reacting to the inputs that we've received from the environment. It doesn't assume that we're thinking anything. All right, we're almost done. Conditioning theories. Sorry, I meant to say cognitive theories. Cognitive theories. Okay, this is a theory that we're going to see a lot across the quarter and all the way through childhood. And so I'm not going to thoroughly explain all of Piaget's cognitive developmental theory at this point, because I'll bring each stage up and stuff like that as it gets appropriate. But Piaget's basic premise was that we seek to understand the world, that we are like, he called us little scientists when we're toddlers, that we really want to know, how does gravity work? And, if I do this, what reaction will it get from mommy? And, those kinds of things. We want to know how the world works, and that this is a major drive for us throughout our lives. He introduced the concept of scheme. A schema or scheme or schemata is this idea that we understand that we seek to understand the world by making little organizations of information in our minds. Okay, so hopefully you're all seeing my little cartoon drawing here. Nice. You got a kitty cat and a puppy dog sitting out in the field under a sunny sky in front of a barn. Okay, so let's say that you're a toddler, and so far your scheme of animals includes the two animals that live in your house, your cat and your dog. And you've learned the words cat and you've learned the words dog. That's a dog, that's a cat, and you know that as a toddler. So maybe you call it kitty and puppy or whatever, but you've got those concepts. So your scheme of animals in the world so far consists of cat and dog. Now let's say that now you've been living in your little household. This is what you've been seeing. Anytime you go anyplace else, the only animals that you've seen have been dogs and cats, and so your little brain is experiencing equilibrium. Equilibrium, according to Piaget, means that you have a sense of constancy. You feel like you understand the world and that you've represented it accurately. So you're feeling like there's a match, equilibrium, between what you know and how the world actually is. Okay, so everything's going great until your parents take you out to a farm, or you're driving down the road and you pass a cow and you're like, dog. Your parents go, no, that's not a dog, that's a cow. Moo, that's a cow, right? That's a cow, that's not a dog, that's a cow. See, it's big. See, it has horns on its head. See, its udder. Right, so mom and dad help you to recognize the difference between a dog and a cat. That's not a dog, that's a cow. Now, of course, your equilibrium goes out the window, and you're the little guy down here on the bottom thinking thoughts. And you enter a period of what Piaget called disequilibrium. You're like, whoa, 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 whoa. Four-legged things that are not cats are clearly dogs. But mommy and daddy just told me that's not a dog. Confusion, I'm distressed, I'm experiencing disequilibrium, I don't know what to do with this. Well, one thing you could do is say, okay, that's not a dog, that's a cow. Okay. Now my disequilibrium goes away and I experience equilibrium again. I've relabeled it. I've gone, okay, so there are three different kinds of four-legged animals. There are cats, there are dogs, and then there are cows. And I could say, okay, so if it's four-legged and it's small, it's a cat. If it's four-legged and it's medium, it's a dog. And if it's four-legged and it's big, it's a cow. Okay, back to equilibrium. I understand how the world works. So when I see this little horsey, what am I likely to say? Cow. It's big and it's four-legged. Obviously, it's a cow. Oh no. So mom and dad are going to go, that's not a cow, that's a horse. We go through the whole process again. What if I see a sheep? Medium-sized, four-legged, clearly a dog. Now, if you guys know any babies, you might have experienced this, where they're using a word that they know and misapplying it. It's called overgeneralization. And it's a sign of them developing their scheme, their organization of how the world works. And it takes a lot of stress and struggle and striving to accurately represent the world using the correct words. And so you'll oftentimes hear kids when they're first confronted. There was an America's Funniest Home Videos episode where the child was it knew all of his letters, so he was like reading out all the letters. Like he read out the letters for alligator, and then he, instead of saying alligator at the end of it, he goes shark at the end, because he knew toothy animals are sharks. So even though he said all the correct letters, he called it in the long run the wrong name because it fit his schema of a shark. He doesn't really read, he just knows his alphabet. So he look at the picture, I don't know what that is, shark, right? Children do it all the time because their schema is not well developed enough to explain all, to accurately represent all the different creatures that exist in the world yet. So slowly but surely, going through this period of equilibrium, disequilibrium, equilibrium, disequilibrium, they ultimately can represent the world accurately. So that's the premise with Piaget's theory. Like I said, we're going to go through the different stages of Piaget's theory as is appropriate throughout the quarter. So we'll come back to him. Now, one of Piaget's students was named Kohlberg, and he developed this very related theory to explain how kids develop their moral reasoning. So Piaget said that we go through these cognitive stages and try and make sense of the world and things like that. Kohlberg says, I think we do the exact same things for all cognitive issues, including making moral decisions about what's right and wrong. So he says when we're little, we're at the bottom of the ladder. Like very small children are what he called pre-conventional. They don't yet understand how the rules and things of the group work. So they are pre-convention is another word for law or rule or standards or norms. So pre-conventional don't yet understand what the rules and norms are. So in stage 1, pre-conventional children are focused exclusively on avoiding punishment. They do the right thing because they don't want to be punished for doing the wrong thing. So if mommy tells a small child, don't eat those cookies, they're for the bake sale tonight, and then goes upstairs to take a shower, leaving her 5-year-old alone with the cookies, if he doesn't eat the cookies, it's probably because he's afraid that he'll get punished for it. When he gets to the next stage of development, he will be more likely to obey because he's hoping he'll get some kind of reinforcement for it. It's called instrumental obedience because he's obeying because he's hoping it'll get him something. So mommy says don't eat the cookies. He doesn't eat the cookies and hopes that she'll be so proud of him for not having gotten into the cookies that he'll actually be rewarded with a cookie. So in the pre-conventional level, initially we're trying to avoid punishment, and then as we mature a little bit more, it moves on to, or we're hoping we'll get rewarded for obeying. The next stage of development is called the conventional level because now we're understanding that there are rules and that we're supposed to follow them. So in the conventional level, the first stage would be, so this is called stage 3 of his overall ladder. We're worried about interpersonal concordance. That is, we want to fit in. So our moral decisions may be based more on what everybody else is doing in our group and making sure that they all think that we're cool and we fit in and stuff like that, and less on what is objectively the right or wrong thing to be doing. So in other words, this is the foundation of peer pressure, right, that we're trying to fit in. In stage 4, we start to recognize that some people have been given legitimate authority, and so we're supposed to follow their orders, and that we live in a social order kind of situation where, for example, someone in authority has been given the right to just say how fast we should be traveling on particular roads. And because somebody who knows more than we do has decided that that's the safe traveling speed, we're all supposed to do it. We're all supposed to go at the speed that the sign tells us to go, that we've all agreed to that sort of like social order. So our job is to follow the rules because the authorities laid out the rules and that they are allowed to do that and we're supposed to follow them. So we're following the rules because of the rules. So in stage 3, we're following the rules of our group and trying to get along. Stage 4, we're following the rules because they're the rules. The next phase would be post-conventional. Now we have gone beyond just the rules. Post-conventional means we've gone past just following the rules. And so in stage 5, the first stage of it is moving beyond just thinking, well, the authorities had the right to make these rules. And in stage 5, we start to say, well, I mean, we all live in a society. We all need to follow the rules. None of us are above the rules. It's the fair thing to do, right? We have a social contract. And if I start just doing whatever I want and everybody else starts just doing whatever they want, we're going to have chaos. So we're supposed to do it. And then stage 6 is when we start to acknowledge that there are universal ethical principles and that sometimes even something that is a legal activity is a morally wrong activity, or something that is an illegal activity is a morally correct activity. So in the universal ethical principles stage, we might say things like, I know that the posted speed limit says 55, but I've got my injured friend in the back seat, and the ethical thing to do is to put his acute injury and needing to get to the hospital above these stupid posted signs that didn't take into account this particular situation, right? So according to Kohlberg, as we mature cognitively, we start to move through these stages of development. He definitely said that not everybody reaches the top levels of development. Some of his tests for assessing moral development were kind of sex biased. because he would give a moral conundrum. Like, for example, he'd basically tell the plot of Les Miserables, where a guy gets arrested for stealing bread and medicine for his ailing wife and put in jail, and he ultimately escapes and then builds a new factory up in a distant part of the country, and somebody recognizes, hey, wait a second, that's the escaped convict, and that person has to decide, do I turn him in and lose this factory and all these jobs that all the people in town all work, and he's been an upstanding citizen ever since I've known him, or do I keep it quiet? And that's the moral question, like, what do I do? These questions were considered sex biased because a lot of times women would start off by saying things like, well, this sounds a lot like something that my friend experienced, and then give their opinion. And as soon as they said friends, they would be characterized as being in stage 3 because it sounds like they're giving an answer based on trying to get along with the other people, rather than the bigger picture that came after that. This sounds like something that happened to my friend. So women were scoring lower than they probably should have. People who are chronic criminals tend to score more in the pre-conventional level. So there are some things about Kohlberg's moral ladder that have been, this theory has been well substantiated through different kinds of studies and things like that. Now, the information processing theory is a lot less stage-based and much more looking at just sort of how we process information, right? And it says, we think a lot like a computer thinks. This is sort of a, like little gross model saying that, we have some of the same, we have parts of our brain that function a lot like individual parts of a computer. And so if we think about it like that, us and our binary code make decisions that are very rational based on previous experience and things like that. So when we talk about the information processing theory, you will always come back to this idea that you think like a computer does, and that the more experience you have with something, the more you can behave in an automated way, a lot like a computer can. You know how when you've been on a web page, your computer stores cookies on your computer so that the next time you go to that web page, it loads faster. It's just like that, right? And having had a lot of experience with something makes it easier for you to do it, and it makes you able to do it without having to think, makes it easier for you to do something else at the same time that you're doing the thing that you've done a bunch of times, those kinds of things. So very much like a computer. So you're faster, you're more efficient, and all those things as a function of experience. Now, the cultural and contextual theories are our last type of theories, and one of these is no longer really covered in our textbook very well. But in the cultural contextual theories, we have Vygotsky, and he was Russian, and he said, we have to take into consideration the social situation that the individual finds themselves in, and then also the historical context that they find themselves in. And this gets at that cohort effect issue that I was talking about in chapter 1. The idea that the time period in which you were raised will have an impact on your development. And so Vygotsky developed this idea of the microsystem, the mesosystem, the exosystem, and how these different aspects of our environment have more or less influence on our development. Bronfenbrenner's picture looks a whole lot like Vygotsky's. Bronfenbrenner called it the ecological theory, and you'll see there's some difference. I mean, he talks about like individuals and peers being the things that are the closest to us, right? So it's us, and then people who are the most like us, relatively our same age, could be siblings. Then you got family as the next ring out, then you got your school, then you got your community, and then the larger culture, and so on. And so both of these guys are taking into consideration that there's a dynamic interplay between the individual and the different layers of influence around them. So you're not like in the behavioral learning theories just a passive sponge who's been reinforced or punished toward or away different behaviors. Instead, in the cultural contextual theories, you are affecting your environment and your environment is affecting you. It's a two-way street. You'll notice all these two-way arrows in both of these pictures. So you're not passive. You're not the only active person, right? You're influencing other people, and that's causing them to react differently to you, and so on. So those two theories, very similar to each other, but kind of different. All right, well, that concludes chapter 2, so I will see you guys in chapter 3.